Hey y'all! So today we're going to be covering section 5.7, which is about meat production methods. So the learning objective for today is that you can identify different methods of meat production and that you can describe the benefits and drawbacks of these different methods. You're getting a whole lot of essential knowledge here about concentrated animal feeding operations, how meat production is less efficient than plant production, things like free-range grazing, but also overgrazing, and how sometimes animals can be leading to greenhouse gas emissions. We'll cover all that. So we'll first start out by looking at CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs for short. They're also sometimes called feedlots. So these are going to be densely crowded areas where animals are going to be fed grain, most often corn, to raise them as quickly as possible. So this is basically what a feedlot is going to be looking like. Now, the big benefit of this is that it maximizes your land use and profit. So you can get the most amount of meat production per unit area, which ultimately is going to minimize the cost of meat for consumers, so more people are going to be able to afford it. Now, some downsides is you have to give them antibiotics and growth hormones. The antibiotics are used to prevent diseases because they're all packedly crowded, and so disease can have an outbreak pretty quickly. And then you're giving them hormones to speed up their meat production so that they can get big and fat really quickly so that you can harvest them sooner and maximize your turnover of these animals that you're raising. Another downside is going to be the fact that these animals produce a large volume of waste, which can contaminate nearby surface or groundwater. They also are going to produce large amounts of greenhouse gases, which lead to climate change from increased temperatures. Some of the things that they release are going to be carbon dioxide from breathing, methane, which is actually from their farts. That's a large source of greenhouse gases, is agriculture animal farts. And they also release nitrous oxide, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this concern for the contamination of from their waste. So in these areas where you have CAFOs, you are going to end up with manure lagoons. And these are large open storage pits for their waste, their manure. So if you look here, if all the cows live in these barns, this is going to be directly pumping their waste from their manure and urine to end up in this manure lagoon. Now, this waste is going to contain ammonia, which is really high in nitrogen. It's going to have the hormones that they were given, the antibiotics that they were given. It's going to have a lot of fecal coliform bacteria, which one of the bacteria that lives in this manure is going to be E. coli, which is harmful to humans. One of the biggest concerns with manure lagoons is that, as you can see in this picture here, if you get a really heavy rain, it can actually flood the lagoons and contaminate all the nearby surface and groundwater with runoff. This also has happened with hurricanes. So all of this lovely brown water is going to be from a storm that came in, and this would normally be the lagoon right here, but it has spread all over the place. So the problem with this ending up in other water sources is going to be, first of all, that E. coli I talked about, which is harmful to humans. So if it gets into the groundwater, that's a big concern. Ammonia, which is high in nitrogen, that can lead to eutrophication of your local rivers, lakes, and those areas. And also those antibiotic and growth hormones that they were given can alter the hormonal system of humans and also of animals. So if this gets into a nearby lake, it's going to impact your fish and your frogs and potentially other living organisms there. And additionally, the denitrification of ammonia in manure is going to produce nitrous oxide, which, as I mentioned on the last slide, is a really powerful greenhouse gas that's going to be really efficient as trapping in the heat, which continues to cause global warming. Now, a potential way that we could use this so that there's not just manure sitting around waiting to cause problems, is it can be emptied and buried in landfills, which is obviously not super sustainable. But another option is going to be turning it into fertilizer pellets so that you can use that strong amount of nutrients and ammonia in order to be beneficial for crops. So one of the ways that we can take away these manure lagoons is through free range grazing. And this is where we're going to have animals, usually cows, are going to graze on grass and grow, and they're going to grow just at a natural rate without growth hormones. The FDA actually has regulations for if people are calling their animals free range. There's certain specifications that they need to meet, and so the hormones that they can use, that kind of stuff is also going to be regulated. So this is what it would look like for free range grazing cows. Now, one of the benefits of this is, in addition to not using growth hormones to pump them up, you also don't need to use antibiotics because they are a more dispersed population. And so you're not going to have disease just ravage an entire population because they're in kind of a bit of a healthier spread out area. You also do not need to produce corn to feed these animals. So that's going to be just all the things that come with corn production, like potential pesticides, using up water, the land, all of that. You don't have to make that because they're just eating off the land as it is. Another big benefit, which is going to take away our concerns with manure lagoons, is that the waste is actually dispersed over the land naturally. As they poop and pee, that's just where it is going to be, is right there in the land. So this is actually even going to be beneficial to the soil because it's going to act as a natural fertilizer instead of all of this just building up in those lagoons. Now, the biggest downside to free range grazing is going to be the fact that it requires more total land use. And so the pound of meat production is going to end up ultimately being much more expensive to the consumer. This is why your free range meat at the grocery store costs way more than non-free range meat. But another potential benefit of this is that you can have the animals grazing on land that might be too dry for most crop growth. So in really dry areas where you might not be able to thrive at growing some of your crops, grass is going to be able to grow here, so you can have these cows in areas that already would not be very beneficial for agriculture. Now, a potential downside of free range is going to be overgrazing. And this is where you have too many animals grazing on an area of land, and that can lead to removing all of the grass. It just gets eaten down basically to the roots, which ultimately is going to lead to topsoil erosion. Those plants are going to die. Their roots are not going to be holding the topsoil down, so you're going to have wind and rain can just come and take off the topsoil, which we can see here in this diagram here. On the left has been overgrazed. On the right is just going to be like a normal, healthy pasture. Additionally, animals, as they're walking in these areas, can also compact the soil, which is going to decrease the water holding capacity, which also is going to lead to more erosion because ultimately this dries out the soil. And eventually this can lead to what's known as desertification. And this can occur if plants are killed by overgrazing and the soil is compacted so much that it can't hold enough water anymore. So it's as if you were basically going to be in a desert, even if this isn't normally a climate that might be a desert climate, just because the ground is almost devoid of moisture. Now, a way that you can prevent this is to do what's known as rotational grazing. And this is where you're going to move the animals periodically. And this is going to prevent overgrazing. So if you look at this grass here, we see on the left-hand side, this would be grass that's getting potentially overgrazed. It's just getting eaten constantly. Versus if you had some different areas and you're rotating this livestock through that, and every few weeks you rotate it to a new area, that's going to give the grass time to recover and grow back, which is just going to make it a healthier plant. You're going to have more grass because it just keeps growing and not dying off, and it's going to be healthier, and the roots are going to help the topsoil. So basically just all of this is going to be good. And you can even increase the the growth of the grass by distributing these animals, because their manure is going to continue to be a natural fertilizer for all these different areas. And this clipped grass is just going to be at a thriving point where it's going to rapidly grow because it's not being eaten down to the very bare roots. Oh, so right here, if we look at this growth rate, we're going to have more growth rate right here in the middle, because when it gets too far, it actually goes to seed and it dies off. So dead grass is not helpful for us. And when it is at the lower end here, it's also going to die off because it's just not doing very well. So if you're rotating, it's just going to continue being chomped at about this middle maximum growth rate area, which is going to be ultimately the best for the grass, and it gives you more food for the livestock. So overall, when we are talking about this, you may have started thinking that the production of meat is actually not super efficient. Producing meat for humans is far less efficient than producing plants in terms of energy, land, and water use. So when we're talking about energy use, you first have to use energy to plant and grow and harvest all the plants that those animals will need, plus all of the energy usage for the animals themselves. So you need to be able to pump fresh water to those animals. You need to house them. When it's cold, they're going to need heat. You as a farmer, you're going to need light. So it's going to require energy to do all of that. You also are going to require energy to slaughter and package them and then transport them so that they are getting to the grocery store. And that's going to be a lot of steps. If you look at this graph here of the kilowatts per hour per pound, basically the energy that is required to produce 1 pound beef is going to take way more than pork. But ultimately down here, if we're just looking at like corn and apples, which are plants, they take way less energy. Additionally, in addition to energy, we also have land. So you need to take up land for all the energy, or all of the land, sorry, that should say land, all of the land needed to grow plants to feed the animals, plus all of the room that the animals take up themselves. So it's like double usage of land. So if you're looking at the usable protein per acre of farmland, in an acre of farmland, we might only be able to get like 20 pounds of beef, but we can get 356 pounds of soy or 265 pounds of rice. And additionally, if we're looking at water usage, we're going to have all of the water for crops that animals eat, plus the water that the animals drink. So this is just kind of like a doubling up for the plants that are needed for the animals and the animals themselves. So right here, if we look at the liters of water that are used to produce 1 gram of protein, 1 gram of a cow is going to be 112 liters of water. And 1 liter is like 2 grande Starbucks cups. So that is a ton of water in order to get 1 gram of protein, which a gram is a very small amount compared to the amount of water that's going to be needed for like beans or grains or vegetables is far less than that. So for your practice FRQ, you're going to practice the suggested skill of data analysis based on this that I just showed you with the liters of water that is needed to produce 1 gram of protein. For practice FRQ 5.7, I want you to explain an environmental benefit of eating a plant-based diet rather than a meat-based diet using the data below. So that'll be your practice FRQ for 5.7, and those were your notes on 5.7 for meat production. I personally think this is a fascinating topic, so I hope that you learned something from this.